When the gunfire finally stopped and the dust settled over the hills above the Little Bighorn River, more than 200 United States soldiers lay dead. Their weapons scattered, their horses fled or fallen, their equipment abandoned across a battlefield that stretched for miles. What happened next is rarely told. Lakota and Cheyenne warriors moved through the field, claiming what remained. But these were not random souvenirs. They were war trophies, each one taken in the heat of combat or pulled from the hands of the fallen. And for the next 50 years, many of these objects would remain hidden, wrapped in cloth, buried beneath lodge floors, or locked away in trunks. Not out of shame, but out of survival. This is the story of what those warriors took from Custer's battlefield, and why they kept it secret for half a century. Stand before the image of a Lakota elder holding a cavalry carbine. His hands, weathered by decades, grip the wooden stock with a familiarity that speaks of memory, not reverence. This weapon is a Springfield Model 1873 carbine, standard issue for every trooper who rode with the 7th Cavalry that day. At first glance, it appears to be a formidable rifle, accurate at range, powerful enough to drop a buffalo at 300 yards, trusted by the United States Army. But look closer. The action is open, the breech exposed. And if you could examine the chamber under magnification, you would find the telltale scratches left by men desperately trying to pry out stuck cartridge cases with their fingernails, with knives, with anything they had. Because the Springfield had a fatal flaw. It fired a copper-cased cartridge. Under rapid fire, the soft metal expanded in the hot chamber and refused to eject. Soldiers were found with their rifles jammed open, their ammunition exhausted, their hands bloodied from trying to clear the malfunction. Some archaeological evidence from the battlefield suggests troopers threw their useless carbines aside and drew revolvers in the final moments. The warriors knew this weakness. They had fought soldiers before, at the Rosebud, at Powder River, in skirmishes across the plains. They knew that if you could close the distance fast enough, if you could force the soldiers to fire repeatedly, the Springfield would betray its user. And when it did, the fight was over. This particular carbine was claimed by a young warrior named Runs the Enemy. He kept it for the rest of his life, not as a functional weapon. Ammunition was scarce and dangerous to possess, but as proof. Proof that he had been there. Proof that he had survived. Proof that on one June afternoon, the United States Army's most trusted rifle had failed its men. There is a persistent myth about the Battle of the Little Bighorn, one that refuses to die no matter how many historians correct it. The myth of Custer's cavalry charging with sabers drawn, glinting in the Montana sun. It never happened. But that doesn't mean warriors never took cavalry sabers as trophies. They did, just not from this battle. Sabers captured in earlier engagements, or taken from other frontier posts, became prized possessions among certain warrior societies. Not for combat. A saber is an awkward weapon compared to a war club or lance, but for ceremony. Some were carried in victory dances. Others were kept as symbols of defeated enemies, tangible proof of battles won. The absence of sabers at Little Bighorn tells us something important. The 7th Cavalry was stripped down for speed, expecting a quick strike against what they believed would be a fleeing village. Instead, they rode into the largest gathering of native warriors ever assembled on the northern plains, somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 fighters. No sabers, no reinforcements, no chance. In the chaos of 19th century cavalry combat, soldiers needed a way to identify their unit, to rally when scattered, to know where their officers were in the smoke and confusion. That's what guidons were for. Small, swallow-tailed flags carried by designated standard bearers, each one bearing the company letter and regimental insignia. Company flags were not decorative. They were survival. When Custer divided his command into 3 battalions that morning, each unit carried its guidon. Companies C, E, F, I, and L rode with Custer toward the northern end of the village. Companies A, G, and M remained with Major Reno. Companies D, H, and K stayed with Captain Benteen. By late afternoon, 5 of those guidons were gone, claimed by warriors as Custer's command disintegrated on the ridgeline, now known as Last Stand Hill. One guidon, belonging to Company 1, was later found by Lakota warriors and kept hidden for decades. The fabric, once a bright red and white, had faded. Bullet holes punctured the silk. Bloodstains darkened the lower edge where the staff had fallen across a dying man. To the 7th Cavalry, losing the company flag was the ultimate disgrace, a symbol that the unit had been overrun, that order had collapsed into panic, that the fight was lost beyond recovery. To the warrior who took it, the guidon represented something different. Victory, yes, but also a warning. The flag proved that no matter how powerful an enemy appeared, no matter how well armed or well trained, they could still be defeated. That their symbols could be torn down. That their certainty could be shattered. The guidon stayed hidden until 1926, when an elderly Lakota man finally allowed a photographer to document it. Even then, he would not say who had taken it, or from which soldier's hands it had been pulled. Some memories, he said, were not meant to be shared. Pocket watches were standard equipment for cavalry officers in 1876. They needed to coordinate movements, synchronize attacks, maintain discipline across separated units. Time, in military operations, meant everything. After the battle, several watches were recovered from the field by Cheyenne and Lakota warriors. Most were simple enlisted men's timepieces, cheap, durable, unremarkable. But a few were finer pieces, engraved with initials, carried by lieutenants and captains who would never return home. One watch, taken from an unidentified officer, had stopped at exactly 4:47 p.m. We don't know if the impact of a bullet stopped the mechanism, or if the watch simply wound down in the hours after its owner fell. But that frozen timestamp gives us something historians spend careers searching for, a precise moment in the chaos. Archaeological work and survivor testimonies suggest the final collapse of Custer's position occurred somewhere between 4:30 and 5 p.m. The watch corroborates that timeline. It tells us the fight was not a brief massacre, but a sustained engagement lasting well over an hour, perhaps closer to 2. The warrior who claimed this watch kept it wrapped in buckskin for 40 years. He never wore it, never showed it, never wound it. He told his grandson that the stopped hands were important. They marked the moment when one world ended and another began, even if that new world would bring suffering they could not yet imagine. When the watch was finally photographed in the 1920s, the hand still read 4:47. Frozen. Permanent. Not every weapon on the battlefield that day belonged to the 7th Cavalry. Some of the warriors who fought Custer carried rifles that were, in certain ways, superior to the standard-issue Springfield carbine. Winchester repeaters, Henry rifles, and in at least one recorded case, a Spencer repeating carbine, a weapon that could fire 7 shots without reloading, a devastating advantage in close combat. The Spencers were older technology by 1876, largely phased out by the military in favor of the Springfield. But they were still deadly, especially in the hands of experienced fighters who understood their mechanics. Some had been acquired through trade. Others were taken in earlier battles against soldiers or rival tribes. A few were gifts from traders willing to skirt federal law for profit. After the fight, warriors armed with repeaters often reclaimed ammunition from fallen soldiers, though the calibers rarely matched perfectly. Some used battlefield scavenging to keep their weapons functional. Others took Springfield carbines specifically for their more common ammunition, knowing they could resupply by raiding freight wagons or ambushing patrols. One Spencer carbine, photographed decades later in the hands of a Cheyenne veteran, bears marks that suggest extensive use. The wood is worn smooth where hands gripped it repeatedly. The metal shows pitting from weather and age. Small brass tacks have been pressed into the stock in a geometric pattern, a personalization that marked the weapon as belonging to a specific warrior, a specific fighting society. This customization was common. Captured military weapons were often modified, decorated, and transformed from tools of the enemy into symbols of resistance. A trooper's carbine became a warrior's prize. Government-issue steel became a family heirloom. The Spencer in this photograph was never surrendered during the reservation years. It was hidden, like so many other items, passed from father to son with instructions to keep it secret, to protect it, to remember what it represented. Inside the saddlebag, scattered across the battlefield, were items more personal than weapons or equipment. Letters from home, photographs of wives and children, small Bibles, pocket knives inscribed with names, harmonica reeds, decks of cards, the fragments of ordinary lives carried into extraordinary violence. Warriors gathering equipment after the fight would have encountered these items, but most could not read English. The letters were incomprehensible, marks on paper that held no meaning, no context, no connection to the men who carried them. Some were discarded, some were burned, others were kept, not for their content, but for their material. Paper was useful. It could wrap sacred objects, start fires, patch holes in lodge covers. The words written on it were irrelevant. Decades later, a handful of these letters surfaced when families finally felt safe enough to display battlefield items. Historians were able to trace some back to specific soldiers, to match handwriting with military records, to reconstruct the final days of men whose names had been reduced to casualty lists. One letter, carried by a private whose identity remains disputed, was found folded inside a leather pouch taken by a Lakota warrior. It described a garden back in Ohio, a mother asking her son to come home soon, a hope that the campaign would end quickly so he could return for the autumn harvest. He never read that letter. It arrived at Fort Lincoln after he had already marched west. It was forwarded to his unit. It was in his saddlebag when he died. The warrior who took the pouch kept the letter inside for 50 years, unread, untranslated, preserved by accident rather than intention. When it was finally examined in 1926, the ink had faded, but the words were still legible. Historians transcribed it. The soldiers' descendants, located through genealogical research, were able to read their ancestors' final piece of undelivered mail. History sometimes survives in the strangest places. For decades, the objects taken from the Little Bighorn battlefield remained invisible to American historians. They existed in native homes, wrapped and hidden, passed down through generations who understood that displaying them openly could invite suspicion, confiscation, or worse. Federal policy after the Indian Wars was clear: assimilate or face consequences. Traditional practices were banned. Warrior societies were dissolved. Anything that celebrated military resistance could be grounds for punishment. So the trophies stayed hidden, not because the warriors were ashamed of what they had done, but because the government that now controlled their lives refused to allow them the dignity of their own history. It was only in the 1920s and 1930s, when the last veterans of the battle had grown old, that some of these items began to surface. Photographers were allowed into homes. Objects were brought out into daylight. Stories, long kept silent, were finally spoken aloud. The images that survive from that era are haunting. Elderly men and women holding rifles, revolvers, cartridge belts, and clothing, their faces weathered by age and hardship, their hands steady despite the weight of memory. They were not posing for propaganda. They were bearing witness. Each object you see in those photographs is a survivor, just like the people holding them. They outlasted the battle, the reprisals, the reservation years, the deliberate erasure of history. They are proof that even when a people are defeated, displaced, and silenced, the artifacts of their resistance endure. These were not souvenirs. They were never souvenirs. They were claims staked in blood and dust on a June afternoon when, for a few hours, the outcome of history hung in balance. They were reminders that battles are not won by better equipment or superior numbers alone, but by will, by strategy, by fighting for survival on your own land. And they were, in the end, memory made tangible, carried forward by hands that refused to let the truth die.